Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Curt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
It's episode 72 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm here today with Curt. Jerry can't make it today, but we have a special guest, Dr. Robert T. Muller. I have his new book here, Trauma and the Struggle to Open Up. Finished it about a week ago. Really excited to dive into this. I think it has a lot of really great information that we've talked about on the show in the past. And one of the themes that we've been talking about is just how a lot of people aren't ready when we first meet them to really go into all their trauma history. And sometimes if we push that too quickly, we might rupture the relationship and the person might not come back, and we shouldn't be blaming them if we're pushing them too early, too quickly. So I'm really excited to get into this book. As always, we're going to start out with our bright, shiny objects of the week, and Curt and I are going to be polite and let Rob introduce himself formally and tell us what he's sort of thinking about at this point.
Sure, yeah. So I don't know how formally to introduce myself, but I'll just say that, like as you mentioned, I wrote that book recently, which took a heck of a lot of work, and so now I have a little bit of free time, which is a very nice thing. So I'm getting to do a little bit of skiing these days, which I had to put on hold for about a year. So my wife's very happy. And so I'm right now. So bright shiny object. I'm reading a book now, which is really getting me thinking a lot. It's called The Septembers of Shiraz, and it's about the Iranian Revolution, and it's so for a trauma therapist, it's really interesting because it's about I won't go into great detail, but it's about a family and what happens when the dad is imprisoned for his political opinions, and then what happens to the rest of the family as that's kind of happening. So it's really about family and relationships and trauma, and so it's just getting me thinking, and I just love reading stuff like that. So
very, very cool. Very cool. Well, I'll go next. Mine is actually a gadget this week. Curt, an episode or two ago, we read, I think actually last episode, we read an article from the founder of HeartMath. And so Curt got me interested, and they have a heart rate variability reader as well as an app. And, I really like it. I've been taking the reading for the Welltory app on my finger, and I'm starting to get a callus from burning it on my phone light. So now I can just clip this to my ear. I can even take a reading while we do the podcast. So really, really like the reading. I like the reading a little bit more than the HeartMath app. But I can use it for Welltory as well and not burn my finger anymore. So the healing of my, probably like 8th degree burn or whatever it might be. But I really like it. It's a cool little tool, and I'm excited to explore HeartMath a little bit more. And I'll give everybody an update how my continuous obsession now with heart rate variability, thanks to Curt, is going. So
that's pretty cool. I haven't seen that one before.
Yeah, it's a pretty good. I think it costs about like $120, and it's a Bluetooth and works really well. You can move more. You can kind of talk while you're taking a reading. Yeah. So it's kind of nice not to like get your finger right there and then eventually burn it a little bit on the way out. So
it's the same technology, right? It's optical reading from capillary.
Yeah. So it has the optical reader that goes on your ear. So. Yeah, it's pretty cool. So I'm trying to put these things, okay, we've got a smartphone, we got an app, we've got a Bluetooth reader, and how much this would cost for sort of people start using this in programming. So I'm working on it. I'm not there yet, but I'm working on it. I got some smart people who know where the funding is looking for us. So we'll see how that happens.
There's another little device called the iFleet. Only with I. and it was developed a few years ago, and it's a finger sleeve.
Yeah.
It plugs into the port on the bottom of your phone, and that's how it takes the optical reading from your fingertip. And it's like completely designed for athletic training use.
Yeah, I think I've seen that too.
You recover from the previous day's sympathetic arousal that lasts after your workout, which we would call that the afterburn, right? That's
Yes.
like how long your heart rate stays elevated, which is sympathetic arousal. And once you've recovered from that, you're ready for the next hard workout. And I mean, it's really kind of a cool concept, I think.
Yeah.
We dove into it. Rob, I don't know if you've heard we did 6 episodes on heart rate variability.
Oh, really? Okay.
The
Cool.
impact that our cardiac function has on cortical function and on system activity, just the brain-body connection again. And
that's great. Oh, I'll have to check those out.
It was really fun. It was an enjoyable series to do. There was a lot of reading we did. Sorry about that, Matt. Pretty dense articles your way.
Yeah, well, and I think if I can kind of transition a little, Curt, for our guests, since we're nerding out again. You know, one of the interesting things I did, and I want to get some questions on your book pretty quickly, but you know, we're starting to, I think, with these articles we read, see that biomarkers could give us an idea of whether or not someone's ready for social engagement. And I think, so I'm kind of reading Curt's articles while I'm reading your book at the same time. So I thought it was a really interesting mix as you sort of talk about the avoidance piece. And I guess that leads kind of into the first question is, you know, why is avoidance of the traumatic past so common with those that experience trauma? I think it's kind of a, well, duh, Matt, who wants to talk about their trauma? But I think it's a good, even though it's kind of a simple question to start, your book gave me a lot more insight on sort of the why behind that avoidance is there.
Yeah. I'm happy to talk about that. I think there are people who come into therapy ready to talk about their traumatic experiences and wanting to. And sometimes we have to, as therapists, almost put the brakes on a little bit and slow them down because they get overwhelmed. And then there are those who are almost the opposite, who will come in and not even, you know, they may be aware of the trauma of their past, but it's very difficult for them to engage with it in any way, and they use avoidance as a strategy, and it's a coping strategy. And where does it come from? I talk about this in the book a lot. There are a lot of fundamental themes in the family that lead to avoidance, and one of the big ones is family secrecy. In families where they don't tell about stories from their past, where there are overwhelming events that people are scared to address, there's a kind of disengagement in those families and avoidance of interpersonal stories. And so very often what you see are teenagers who don't even know their parents, if the parents have had a trauma history, and kids sometimes are even surprised to find out that their parents have been through what they've been through. I've worked with parents where their kids don't know them. Oh, I don't want to tell my child about that. And I'm not necessarily saying you go telling your kids things that they're not yet ready to hear, but it's a sign of something very important about that family structure, which is there's a lot of secrecy there. And then there's also family loyalty as another piece. When family members, when people have had interpersonal trauma in the family, sometimes what you have is this family loyalty where let's say one sibling will be loyal to one parent and the other sibling will be loyal to the other parent, and you might have a child who says, well, you know, there was abuse in the family, and their sibling will say, you're crazy, mom and dad were perfect, and you know, you don't know what you're talking about, and then that person who was victimized feels stupid, feels like, you know, they're, you know, confused about reality. And so there's this feeling of, am I being disloyal to my family? Maybe I shouldn't be talking about this. So these kind of very strong, powerful cultural pieces of secrecy and family loyalty pull people toward a kind of silence about the trauma, avoiding it. And then even some self-deception, you know, they question themselves, you know, well, I feel like this happened, but am I making things up? Am I making a mountain out of a molehill? Am I being ridiculous? Am I being unreasonable? That kind of self-doubt and that sort of thing. So that's often where I see avoidance coming from. Those things.
Curt, I wonder your thoughts. Curt's our kind of resident behavioralist, though I think he's a cognitive behavioralist in the closet. But I kind of wonder what your thoughts are of that. You know, I know how you think about with the reinforcement and the family dynamics.
Well, you know, I always kind of tie things back to physical events. That's just kind of how my brain works, right? And one of the really interesting things I think about the avoidance response is in the behavioral language, we call it the avoidance paradox. And that is describing that normally when we look at things like when punishment happens, there's a relationship between physical events that reduces the probability of something happening again in the future, right? Something physical happens. And the same thing with positive reinforcement. When we talk about positive reinforcement and reward, there's a physical event that follows behavior that then increases the probability of that behavior. With avoidance, the real challenge of understanding it and kind of intervening with it is that when the avoidance response happens, what maintains it is the absence of a physical event. It's nothing.
Yeah,
and that's a really interesting kind of like how do you?
There's a term for that in psychology: negative reinforcement, and it's
Right.
So yeah, and the avoidance, and it can be very powerful because you don't have kind of competing new information coming in saying, hey, yeah, you can do something different.
Right.
So that's sometimes no feedback. So sometimes the challenge in therapy is helping people, you know, like change these patterns, and well, how do I know it's going to happen? Well, you haven't tried yet.
Right.
And, you know, and so sometimes the challenge is helping them build a little confidence to try something different. And that can take a long time because of exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. And it's not necessarily it's really hard to get rid of an avoidance response by targeting the avoidance response.
Right.
You don't have like access to the events that really maintain it.
Right.
And
Right.
so focusing on it by trying to get it to go away, you're almost at a loss.
What you need to do in therapy is help people find, you know, what's in it for them to do something different. So it's like, it's not that you're trying to get them to stop doing this other thing, but finding some connection to what's in it for them to try something new and different.
Yeah.
And then that means kind of connecting to some other kind of pathway in a sense. Like with substance abuse, changing that can be so powerful. But sometimes if there's something in it for them, such as, you know, like I want my kids to grow up seeing a dad different than what I grew up seeing. Well, now you're connecting to identity and the person's identity as a father. And that can shift behavior in a way where, you know, hey, you know, drink a little less. Well, listen, it's not fun to drink less. And drinking less is not going to numb the pain. Drinking more numbs the pain. Mm-hmm. So, hey, what's in it for me? Well, you got to find something different in a sense with somebody. And that's kind of part of the art of the therapy. And it can be really challenging.
Yeah.
I mean, tying it to a valued outcome is just, you know, really critical. And almost always that valued outcome is going to be more delayed than the immediate outcome.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Now you've got another problem with like, how do you overcome we have a problem as living beings of tolerating delays.
Yeah.
And that's one of the quintessential problems of behavior change is getting over the hump of the delay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Especially when withdrawals involved too.
Oh yeah.
Like there's a cost to changing the behavior, but the benefit is way into the future.
Right. So what do you think then Rob, about this idea of there's a great slide. It's a Bruce Perry slide, but it's a diagram that shows schematic, right, of norepinephrine and dopamine and the reward circuits of the brain and what acts on the reward circuits of the brain. Mm-hmm. Those are common things that we all kind of know about: sex, drugs, food, candy, sugar, you know, all of those kind of standard things. But also changes in physiological arousal can activate the reward circuits in the brain. Social engagement can activate reward circuits in the brain. And one of the really interesting ones that comes out of some of the fMRI research is that engaging in behavior that's consistent with a value system also activates reward circuits in the brain.
Yeah,
I think might be the kind of the key to how you go about creating this connection to a valued outcome.
Yeah, in chapter 9 in the book, I talk about identity, and one of the fundamental pieces of trauma therapy are changes in identity, helping people reestablish what the values that they find dear to them. I mean, there are a number of things that happen when good trauma therapy occurs. People re-find a sense of dignity in the world, which is really important. They re-find a sense of self-determination. They start to feel like they can actually have some efficacy over their outcomes, and they start to connect to their values. I just yesterday, I had a client say to me, that she had been through terrible domestic violence. And it took a couple years of work kind of helping her start to trust relationships again, and she did. And she's now she worked for a while as a writer, and now she's doing advocacy work. And she says to me, and she was interviewed by some media in the last couple of days, and has been really successful at this. And she says to me, I'm good at it, and the reason I'm good at it is because it really matters to me. Like, I really want to advocate for others. That's something that really means something to me. I never before had this idea that I could do something that actually matters to me. And like, I know that seems in a way obvious to many people, but for someone who had been through such terrible trauma, where her self-esteem was in the pits, like she just didn't feel she had anything to offer, once she kind of regained some self-esteem and then connected to her values, as you're saying, Curt, that helped establish kind of the road towards a new identity. And I'm just so proud of her, actually. Awesome. And she's proud of herself. I mean, that's the other thing. She's proud of herself, which is golden.
Yeah. And I'm a big advocate. I kind of thought it was a self-helpish sort of soft thing to write down your values and think about your values. Sometimes the simple things just, you want to get to the complex stuff. And boy, my major life changes in my own life has been because I finally wrote my own down. And I just see it's such a big piece as far as motivation for change, and taking some of those courageous steps, as you talked about, is really important. I wonder, just a little bit to add on to this first question around this, the role that we often see with trauma of shame as well, and how that sort of plays in to your thinking about avoidance. I know working with teenagers, most of my, therapeutic career was, I just always hear, we talk about the abuse, and I'd hear this next statement that it was my fault, I deserved it. And I just it took so much for me not to just scream at them and say, no way. But it was real. That was their reality. So I kind of wonder, in your thinking, how does shame play into this avoidance phenomenon as well?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Shame is a big theme in trauma. I agree. And so many people blame themselves and say it was my fault. It's kind of the go-to. It's very, very, very common. So that is one of the hardest things to help people work through. And so I like the metaphor of different parts of self, that we all have different parts. We have different ways of being. I have different ways of being me. You have different ways of being you. And I say this to clients, there are different parts of you. And what I often see with the shame thing is that there was a choice that one part of the person made that another part of the person finds unconscionable. So an example of this, a client who, let's say, was sexually abused by her uncle, and she was physiologically aroused, which is a physiological response for many children who are sexually abused. It's not that they wanted to have sex or anything like that. It's that it's a physiological response. I mean, our bodies do that. When we're stimulated, we get aroused, and that's just a thing that happens. And it turns out it happens in children and adolescents as much as it happens in adults. So this person that I'm thinking about in particular in this example feels some sexual, part of her, in a sense, feels some sexual arousal. And then there's another part of her who has grown up with ideas like, this is what's morally right. So there's a part of her that cannot forgive another part of her, that has no compassion for another part of her. So when I work around shame, I try to kind of untangle, like I sort of work with the person around, what are your different sides, what are your different parts, if you will. I'm not talking about dissociative identity disorder. I'm just talking about people who, we all have different ways of being us. And so what I find is, I ask the person to, in a sense, have a kind of conversation with this other part of them. What would it look like if you had compassion for that little girl in you who felt aroused and felt so confused? What would that mean to you? To start opening up that idea. Or the person who was in the military and made choices to follow orders, as you have to when you're in the military, and killed somebody. And there's a part of them that feels terrible shame about that. But there are other parts of them that they would say, well, I feel loyal to the military. I did actually do what I was supposed to. So there are different sides. So again, there has to be a kind of development of empathy for or compassion for that part of the person that made choices that other parts of them find unbearable or unconscionable. And then how do you then work with that? You help the person learn to sit with the fact that we all have sides of us that we don't like. We all have parts of us that we find ugly, unpleasant, we're embarrassed about, and yet we can come to a place where we can live alongside those parts of us. But the key is finding some compassion, if you had a friend, for example, who was a young, what would you say to them is a question you might ask to help build some compassion. And I've had clients say, well, yeah, of course, if I had a friend, I'd say that it wasn't her fault. Like, oh, isn't that interesting? You can say that for a friend, but that little girl in you, that little 6-year-old girl who was visited by her uncle and tried to lock the door and couldn't find a way to keep him out, that little girl doesn't get to have any compassion. That kind of discussion. And then the person's like, oh, yeah, that's interesting. And we slowly build some compassion for that. So that's how I start to work with shame. But I don't want to make it sound like it's a, one session, boom, it's done. No way. It's a slow slogging through this process.
That's interesting that you say that. That was kind of the reaction that I was having to this. I was thinking about new clinicians, and I lump myself into that category, 15, 20 years ago now. And that new clinicians often come out of school thinking that their job is to give people advice. And it just struck me as you were talking of how there is no advice giving in that kind of scenario. There is a lot of listening, and there's a lot of creating the space and, arranging the environment the right way, having the right reactions, being open. And there's just no advice giving in that at all.
Yeah.
That just struck me as you were talking, and how long of a process that would be.
Yeah, it is, and it does depend a lot on how much shame the person feels, and it depends a lot on whether they have some other experiences in their lives where they felt bad about something and somehow worked through it, that you can then call on, well, how did you do that? How did you work through, if they have other pockets of self-esteem, if they have that, then you can sort of transfer self-esteem from one domain to another. It's not that you transfer it, it's you facilitate them transferring it, really, is what you're doing.
Right.
But so it depends a lot on that. But yeah, it can be faster or slower depending on the person.
Right. Yeah. I want to, if I could, I was going to ask this question a little later, but I think it might fit here a little bit better. One of the big takeaways that I had from the book, and I thought how you wrote about it was really fascinating. I think I felt what you were saying, but I thought it was you just put it beautifully, and that was around forgiveness. And I think this is a good follow-up for kind of that shame question of, we're sort of, I was brought up Catholic in the Midwest, and you were just supposed to kind of forgive everybody if they asked for it, especially. And sometimes even if they never asked for it. And I thought your discussion about this in the book was really brilliant. I wonder if you could just kind of, as we talk about the shame and the avoidance and all this psychological damage and the disintegration of different parts of the personality, Talk to us about forgiveness's role, or
Yeah.
how's it? Tell our audience about your thinking.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Matt, I grew up Jewish, so I grew up with Jewish guilt, and it turns out Jewish guilt and Catholic guilt are like, like this.
Yes.
So I got lots of that too.
And we should all call our mothers way more than we do.
100%. So with forgiveness, in trauma therapy, it's a really interesting and complicated matter. But let me just say, I've already talked a little bit about the self, and I'll say that a big piece of the work is helping the person find ways to, like I said, have empathy for and compassion for parts of self that made certain choices or did what they needed to do to survive, and eventually come to a place where they can forgive that part of themselves that made those choices. So that's kind of self-forgiveness, and that's an important piece of trauma work. Regarding forgiveness of the other, it's here when I get this question from clients, one question I have for them is, help me understand what has the person who the offender, or the person who's transgressed, or the person who has hurt you, how are they thinking about this right now? And in some cases, you see an apology, and that's a really important thing when that happens, and it's a complicated thing. If somebody has transgressed and then comes to a place where, listen, I had a really bad drinking problem when that happened. I feel responsible for what I did. Let me try to make it up to you. And so there's a showing remorse. There's a taking responsibility. I think in that situation, if someone who has had a trauma history then grapples with that question of forgiveness, sometimes they do find a way to forgive, and you can help them with that. And I think it can be quite a good experience for that person to wrestle with, okay, here's, this was the relationship there and then, this is the relationship in the here and now. This person has kind of apologized and is clearly feeling bad about it. It can be really healing for somebody to find a way to forgive. Where it can be really a problem, forgiveness, is when the person who's transgressed feels no remorse. There's no taking responsibility. In fact, the person says, oh yeah, my uncle or my whatever, person who, whatever, if it's domestic violence, my ex-husband, he just says I'm crazy. Where there's no taking responsibility, then I work with a person around, in a way, letting go of the fantasy of forgiveness. Because if they feel, I ought to forgive, oh yeah, my ex, he doesn't feel any remorse for what he did, but I'm a bad person if I don't forgive, then I work with them around this idea of, why does my client need to be a martyr? Why do they need to convince themselves that they need to give forgiveness when the person hasn't asked? And if they feel that they're betraying a part of themselves, with some clients, when they feel this pressure to forgive, they feel this sense of, my minister says this, or my husband says this, or my wife says I really ought to forgive, and if they don't feel it in their heart, then it may be this kind of pressure to forgive that, to me, worries me, that they're in a way being disingenuous. And so I help them find a way to grieve the loss of what happened, and maybe the answer around forgiveness is not yet. Maybe they will one day forgive. I'm not telling them, I don't tell them, hey, don't forgive as a bad person. I don't tell them what to do, what not to do. What I say is, it sounds like there's a part of you that really isn't ready. I don't know where this will go. Maybe for now, it's not yet. And that's okay. It's okay for it to be not yet. Let's see where this goes. And that can be kind of freeing for people. Okay, all right, I don't know how I'll feel 20 years from now, but okay, maybe I'm not ready for that yet, and that's all right. kind of giving them some space for that. So it can be complicated, but that's kind of how I try to think of forgiveness.
Well, when I think your example you gave of the young man, I think he was in choir, if I'm remembering right. I thought that was a powerful example because his abuser seemed to make a sincere reach out for forgiveness, and even though he was the abuser seemed genuinely remorseful and everything you kind of said you'd sort of want, the individual was still not ready, and it caused family conflict. And yet I just thought how you held that kind of space for him to, like you said, be okay that maybe not yet. And I think that's a really powerful thing of giving them permission that it's okay still to be pissed off, angry, sad, whatever other emotion, it's okay still.
Yeah, and because there can be a lot of shame around, why aren't I the right kind of victim, the kind of victim who forgives? There's a kind of and then that's an added shame on top of all the other shame. It can be a lot for people, so it kind of gives them permission. Yeah.
Well, if you're not going to write your next book saying, why am I not the right kind of victim? That'll be my next book title, because that's beautiful. And so encompassing of so much of the work I've done too.
Okay.
So go ahead, Curt.
Right? We think about the ways that we develop rules for how to manage our world. Right? We develop cognitive rules for how we manage our world, and then we follow them in the absence of any other guidance, right? So that kind of manages us.
Yeah.
You think about how that gets disordered as a result of going through early childhood, adverse childhood experiences, trauma. Like, one of the things that we do socially for each other is to check with one another and get feedback about, is what I'm feeling reasonable? Is what I'm needing reasonable? How do I meet this need? And is that reasonable? And that gets so quickly disordered and distorted with traumatic experience. And then you get the therapy, and it's like you got to buck all of those rules all over again. They're just the people are fighting against a ghost often.
Yeah, and often there's this pressure in the family to respond in a certain kind of way, especially when there's one family member who's now, when one is sort of now, the story is that things aren't so harmonious, then you get this this feeling that people need to behave in a certain kind of way, and people feel these pressure around these rules, as you mentioned, that are based on their family scripts, on the story, the family story, and kind of how you're expected to behave. So I agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, the next question I want to ask, which I thought is something that I've sort of been struggling with, both in my work with people in the mental health arena, but also I do a lot of work with like the case managers, people at health centers that might not be in that therapeutic role, but are often, especially for folks maybe in poverty or experiencing homelessness, might be the first kind of person in the system that often gets, hopefully, the referral eventually to mental health. So I've been thinking a lot about how sort of we force disclosures on people. I mean, if you look at some of the assessments we put people through, before I have any relationship, I want to ask you about your criminal justice history, your domestic violence history, your substance abuse history, and your basically let's talk about every worst day of your life. Mm-hmm. And then let's engage in a helping relationship. And so your book was really timely for me. I actually read this on my way to a conference in DC where I did my first public rant against these processes. But I'd love to hear you talk about too, because again, your book informed my thinking as well, as how do sometimes as professionals, we make disclosure more difficult or uncomfortable for the folks that we're trying to help.
Yeah. Well, so I think the biggest thing is rushing, and giving permission for people to be able to tell their story in time, over time. And I get it that there's a lot of pressure and a lot of settings, short-term therapy, managed care, pressure that people feel the client maybe place pressure and say, I want to get help fast. So there's a lot of, a lot of push toward the quick fix. And so people think that by getting information out quickly, somehow that the purging will make the person feel better, but it could actually make them feel worse. And so in the book, I talk a lot about these different strategies to slowly put on the brakes, not to bring things to a grounding halt, because people, when they come into therapy and they feel like they're ready, people do want to tell their story. And, again, to different degrees, different people to different degrees. But on some level, when people come in and talk to a therapist of some sort, they know that there's a story they have to tell, and it's So yeah, I get that, but kind of taking it as a slow process is kind of the biggest thing. And so I have a few different strategies in the book that I talk about. I don't know necessarily that I want to go, or I don't know if you want me to go through them here in great detail, but anyway, but that's I think the biggest thing. If we sort of get a kind of a big idea, it's giving yourself permission to slow the process down, to be respectful and to honor the person telling the story, to value the telling of the story, but to say, let's kind of give permission that all the gory details don't need to come out that day, kind of thing. And kind of give it time for it to develop as the relationship develops.
And they certainly all the details can't come out in that first telling, right? That first telling is usually a certain version of it.
Right.
It's going to be told again, and there are going to be other details that come out as it gets repeated.
Right.
You just can't get all the detail out in one telling of the story. It take you forever to get through it.
And this is where trauma therapy does have a lot of benefit from exposure therapy. And I do think that there is a piece that's exposure, but I don't think it's all exposure. Contrary to some of the more traditional behavioral views, I think telling of it and kind of exposing yourself to the trauma, yes, I do think is one piece. Mm-hmm. But exactly as you're saying, because we have identity, we have re-understanding things in new ways. And as the therapy relationship develops, you start to feel more comfortable being vulnerable with your therapist. And so some of those things that you felt ashamed about that you maybe wouldn't have told 2 months earlier, now you feel a little more comfortable with. And it turns out that's the thing that you're actually kind of plagued by, in a way that, the details. So, you might have something like somebody was raped, and I'm not dismissing or minimizing how horrible a rape can be, not by any stretch, but somebody who's been raped, it may be the case that the actual trauma of the event is the most upsetting thing. It may be, but for other people, for other clients I've worked with, that was bad, yes, but what was worse to them, to that person, was how their boyfriend reacted, where he said to her, "Wait, what are you talking about? How could you have let that happen?" Or the way the criminal justice system reacted, where they felt blamed and they felt stupid, and then they felt humiliated. And to them, that's the piece. And so these different layers, as you're talking about, come out at different times, and they have different meanings for people. And so that's kind of the piece that makes it, again, in part about exposure, but in part about working with and re-understanding things in new ways.
Right.
Grappling with your identity, grappling with your place in the world, grappling with your role in this, what you perceive your role to be in this traumatic event, that sort of thing.
And the aspect of memory, I think, is so interesting in what you're saying, is that every time you recall an event, let's even just kind of simplify it and say you recall something on Tuesday, and then 24 hours passes until you recall it again. You recall it then in the context of the next previous 24 hours that just happened.
Right.
What can happen as you recall the same event all over again that changes your recollection of that event.
Exactly.
Things happen within that event. You may be able to put it into a different context.
Right.
Even in it's the same event, it's the same exercise of recalling the memory and the experience, and it just gets involved in a different context because of the passage of time.
Exactly, because memory is so powerfully mediated by the limbic system, which is very emotionally tinged, right? It's the emotions are linked to memory.
Right.
Emotions can create hyperfocus of memory. Emotions can create absence of memory. It can create fragmented memory. And as you change in life, that 24 hours has changed you a little bit, and then a week has changed. You know, as you change, new memories are formed, and they interact with those old memories,
Right.
and you understand and think about them differently. Because the emotions that are linked to them change.
Right.
So exactly, 100%.
I mean, in essence, that's kind of what, maybe one way to even think about that is that's what we're talking about by transformative growth.
Nice.
The interaction of those memories, right? And
Yeah.
as positive repetitive experiences pile up within that, I mean, I'm imagining somebody, I mean, you have such a nice, calm, comforting air about you as we're just talking over video, right? You have a really nice, like, way of saying what you say and have a lot of confidence in your intervention. I can imagine somebody sitting with you and recalling something after and having a different context to remember it within because they had a different experience.
Well, and I think this is where the therapy relationship comes in. I wanted to just make sure we get to this and just say, and I think this is true for any good psychotherapy relationship, where sitting with somebody as you recall a painful event, and feeling, even if all you're doing is you're telling the same story as you told 3 or 4 different times to different people, but now you're telling it in a way with someone where you don't feel judged, you know, where you feel validated, where you feel cared for and loved, if you will, you know, kind of loved in the way that therapy is a loving environment. It's a caring, parental in a way environment. You know, as you do that as a client and you're vulnerable, because boy, when people talk about their stories, they're really in a vulnerable place. As you do that, and you start to feel not blamed but supported, as you feel understood, that becomes transformative. And all of a sudden, you start to question: wait a minute, I thought that I was an idiot for this, but my therapist, or you know, Curt, who I was sitting with, seemed so nice and kind and listened and patient, or Rob or Matt, and I'm feeling different about it. And over time, as that happens through the context of the relationship, this becomes what I didn't come up with this term, the corrective emotional experience. I think that's a very powerful piece of therapy, where it's just simply you're talking about something distressing and you get acceptance. For many trauma survivors, that's new. That's not something they've necessarily, many have not experienced that before. Yeah. So simply being in the presence of another who is accepting and patient and listening and is not blaming, that can feel corrective. And so that becomes in and of itself part of their new story. Hey, I'm not always, it's not 100% of the time that people invalidate me, at least on this one occasion, and it kind of grows from there. And it's a really nice thing to see when that happens. Yep.
And I wonder, I think it was a great kind of, to maybe a question that's not fair because it's so big, but I'll ask it anyway, because Curt knows I love my big questions, is, you know, reclaiming identity. I thought, you know, I've kind of heard it here and I heard it throughout the book too. And could you talk a little bit about, you know, the role of helping people reclaim identity, if I'm using the right words,
yeah.
And how that helps folks sort of gain some power over their past. And sort of take power over that again.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I mean, what I find is that when trauma therapy goes well, people start to there are these little, I don't know how to describe it, these little glimmering moments of self-esteem that they say things that it's like, oh, your self-esteem is growing, and I just sort of file that away, and I start to see, and so then they start coming in with things like you know, things that interest them, or things that they've noticed, and all of a sudden I start to feel toward them feelings that I didn't have previously, like this sort of, I might feel in awe of the person, or like, oh my gosh, wow, I didn't realize you were as smart as you are. And that makes me sound like a jerk. But I mean, when people come in vulnerable, they often make themselves, they feel so bad about themselves, they don't show these positive characteristics. So then as they work together and start to feel better about themselves, these parts of themselves, these talents, these skills that have been sort of dormant for a while start to bubble up. And it's a beautiful thing to see. And so what you want to do is you want to really notice these things as the therapist. You want to pay attention to these signs of growing self-esteem, growing competence, growing feelings of self-validation, those kinds of things. You want to notice that and pay attention and kind of be curious about it and ask the client about it. And what we see are things like increased self-determination. This is something that happens when people start to reclaim identity. They start to feel things like, I'm sick and tired of people telling me what to do. Like when you hear someone say that, I'm like, yes, that's good. Yes, you should be sick and tired. That's my little thought bubble is going, yeah. Well said. And I might even say that to somebody. I might say to somebody, beautifully said. I love the way you said that. I'm sick and tired of people telling me what to do. I might say that to somebody, and then just sort of let that sit. And the person might say, yeah, I mean, like, so, and then they sort of tell some story. And I can just kind of be supportive of this growing self-determination, this idea that, hey, wait a minute. I've been letting people tell me what to do. I'm not okay with that anymore. It's kind of, and again, this happens in little glimmering moments that kind of slowly increase. And then, as I mentioned, signs of dignity. That's another thing that we see as kind of people start to reclaim identity. Signs that, so I'm tired of having people tell me what to do, is a little bit of that as well. But signs that they're feeling like they don't want to be a doormat anymore. They want to, that they're feeling like they deserve. That's a big word. Often people at the beginning of therapy don't feel they deserve. I don't feel like I deserve your time, Dr. Muller. That kind of thing. Oh my gosh, that they start to feel they deserve it. They feel entitled, not in a narcissistic way, but in a healthy way. We all feel entitled to decency. We should feel entitled to decency, to respect, to having the right to have a warm place to sleep and to food. We have a right to feel entitled to those things. When people start to move forward in their trauma therapy, there's a healthy sense of feeling entitled, feeling like you deserve to be treated with respect. So those are all beautiful things as you see that grow, and values, as I mentioned before. You see a growth of the person connecting to their personal values, the values that they hold dear. And those may be very different than my values. And so you want to be careful as the therapist not to impose your values on somebody else. Sometimes the growth of their values and they're finding their values may be a challenge for the therapist if you have different values. But your job is not to impose. Your job is to listen to and help people clarify what their values are. So those are parts of those are all kind of aspects of reclaiming identity.
Wonderful.
I got a couple, Matt, if you don't mind.
Go for it.
So one thing you mentioned was strategies for slowing down, and it made me think about that a little bit. And also, Matt, about a question that you were asking about asking questions too early, enforcing a little self-disclosure. So kind of both of those in both of those concepts together, but also the idea of the power of questions in the therapeutic interaction. When to ask questions, and I wonder if those play into some of the strategies that you're alluding to.
Yeah, I mean, I try not to pummel people with questions. I try to kind of be slow with questions and not because it can feel overwhelming, especially if someone's talking about something very distressing. I like questions that help the person look inward, questions around what, as you talk about this, let's just say, as you talk about this, Judy, what are you feeling right now? And so she might say, I don't know. So, okay, just take a moment, just sort of let's check in with, what are you feeling? What are you feeling in your body? Are you feeling any sensations as you talk about that? So just wait. Just kind of let some silence be there. Slowing things down and giving space for people to focus inward. As you tell me, I use the therapy relationship and ask things like, as you talk about that, what does it feel like sharing this with me? So that's a question that brings the therapy relationship into the room, and it's a different level of question. So, and it's all kind of focused on helping people unpack some of the affects, the emotions that surround their stories.
Mm-hmm.
It can feel embarrassing in front of the therapist. It can feel, or they may feel proud of themselves I don't know what they're feeling, but it gives some space for them to open up to that. Were they feeling emotionally? Sometimes I say, what are you feeling emotionally? What are you feeling in your body? Just to divide that up a little bit. I like asking those kinds of questions. And again, slowing people down in that way.
Wonderful. A question that lingers in my head, and this steps a little bit outside the book, but I think a big struggle right now with, the non-therapeutic folks that I work with, so teachers, medical clinic workers, case managers, sort of level folks. But a lot of times I think there's this dilemma when we talk about the trauma-informed sort of movement, and as it gets into these really amazing other parts of our culture and this knowledge and how it transforms these systems. I think one of the struggles that I kept holding on to of the book for a lot of the folks I train who aren't in a therapy role is, okay, we want to sort of identify individuals whose trauma history might be leading to health issues, to societal issues, socioeconomic issues, relational issues. And so there's this growing understanding that trauma is behind at least a major player in a lot of the struggles that people in our community are having. And yet, then there's the balance of how do we ask the question so we can make a referral to someone like you? And I wonder if you've thought at all about what's sort of maybe the best way for someone who may not have a therapist right next door even to ask the question, who's curious if trauma is playing a role, to get enough information to make then a informed referral.
Yeah, for sure. And I agree with that. I mean, so often we see kids in school struggling with depression or with an eating disorder, teenagers struggling with eating disorders or struggling with attention deficit disorder. And attention deficit disorder does have biological links to it, but it can get worse, as can depression and eating disorders, which also may have some biological aspects to them. They can get much worse if the person has also a trauma history. And so very often it's traumatic events that can tip some of these symptoms over into kind of being really a problem for the person. So that's true for teachers. They may be facing a kid who's having something going on or a terrible divorce at home, and he's just acting out in school and being a class clown or something like that. So yeah, it is difficult. I wouldn't, as in some of those other, especially let's say if it's a teacher, I mean, it's not your job to, and you shouldn't feel like burdened with the responsibility of having a child tell you details about their past. But what you can do is you can be empathic about the fact that there might be something really upsetting and difficult going on without necessarily asking what that is. And if the child can be open about, yes, there is, that we all, I think if you have in mind that we all have stories that we feel bad about, sometimes those stories can really get in the way of how we're doing. And if you're able to have a conversation with someone that sort of asks around that, like, are you feeling like whatever is going on is really, it's getting pretty bad? Are you feeling like it's kind of getting, like whatever's going on at home is kind of really weighing you down? It's a big burden. I mean, if that kind of conversation can happen, then you don't necessarily have to be asking about the details. And I like to distinguish between the idea that there is a story from the details of the story. And I think in that kind of situation, it may not be, but sometimes kids will disclose. And I think for a teacher, because they may feel that this teacher actually understands them and is listening and cares about them and loves them. And so you may find as a teacher that a child has told you, you know, my mom and dad are yelling at each other. I think they're getting a divorce, and they may go into and they may cry. And I think the best thing to do in that situation is just to validate. I mean, just to kind of be present and be empathic and say, and just kind of, you don't have to get in, you don't have to be doing therapy, but validating and saying, you know, thanking them for telling you, you know, I really think it took a lot of bravery to tell me this. Thank you. This is a very upsetting thing. And of course it's upsetting. And you know, your family's going through a really hard time. And that's, of course you're having a hard time. I get it. Kind of that kind of empathic thing can be enough for a kid to know. That I think is a really big deal. And then of course a referral should be made, I think, if possible. Depends on the school, if they have decent guidance, if they have, you know, if the parents have means, if they have health insurance to pay for therapy. I mean, all that stuff, of course, is going to be a big deal. But I don't know if, does that address?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I think that was great. So I want to thank you again, and I'm going to give you a chance to tell a little bit more maybe about yourself, and you have another book as well that I think goes on this, but great book, Trauma and the Struggle to Open Up, Dr. Robert T. Muller. I imagine at least half of our listeners would either like to refer themselves or a client to you right now after, I felt like I've had a great therapy session just listening to your voice. I may have to replay this over and over again. So, you know, anything else, we'll put a link to the book on traumainformedlens.org. As well, if you're interested in that, but just anything, a little bit about your maybe past work if people are interested, and where you're at, and anything else as far as if you want folks to know about you or get a hold of you if they're interested in more information.
Oh, well, if people are interested in asking me questions, I'm very happy to answer. I have a Psychology Today blog called Talking About Trauma. So there I have these weekly posts about different kinds of interesting topics in the area of trauma. And so people can read about, they can also, if you're a therapist listening to the show, you can ask your clients to read this, because it's information for the general community, and people will find that very, very useful, I think. And we also have, my students and I also have an online magazine called the Trauma and Mental Health Report. And so there also we have articles about trauma. And again, these are all written in a magazine style for the general community, for people to learn about how trauma works, and then different aspects of it that can touch people's lives in different ways. So but you can also email me easily. Just if you just Google Robert T. Muller, M-U-L-L-E-R. My email address is all over there, so you can feel free to email me. I'm happy to answer questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. And so as always, I thank the audience for joining us. Next week, we're going to talk about small t trauma. So join us for that, for an interesting discussion about kind of a term that's thrown around a lot out there. So Dr. Muller, thanks so much for your time. This was great. Curt, always great, my friend. And I would just, everybody have a great week, and we'll see you next week. Again, you can find all this information at traumainformedlens.org. Thank you so much.